Welcome everyone to our webinar today, Revisiting Sustainability Goals in a Post-Grant World. This webinar is brought to you by ATE Central with support from the National Science Foundation. You're going to be in listen-only mode for this webinar today, so please use the chat screen to ask questions of our expert panelists today. Let's go ahead and begin with our introduction of today's presenters. Let me start by welcoming Rachael Bauer from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Rachael is the principal investigator of ATE Central. Welcome, Rachael. Please join us and introduce your co-presenter and guest.
Hi, everybody. Great to be here today. This is, one of several webinars we're doing this spring, and Nancy and I can't believe that we've been doing this. This is the 5th year of these sustainability webinars. We've really covered a lot of great ground, and for those of you who haven't been on a webinar with us before, all of these webinars, you can go back and look at all of them and listen to them on the AT Central site. I'm thrilled to have, as always, Nancy Maron with us, who's the founder of BlueSky to Blueprint, and she's going to talk to you in just a couple minutes a little bit more about her background, but just to say hi so you know what her voice sounds like. Nancy, do you want to just give everybody a quick hello?
Yes, thanks, Rachael. Hi, everyone. Glad to be with you today.
I suspect Nancy is getting ready for this storm system. I don't know how many of you are on the East Coast. It's been kind of a crazy time. Madison, Wisconsin just got hit, and it's headed over to the east. So hopefully it is. When's it hitting, Nancy? Is it tomorrow?
I think
at the beginning.
I think right, like late tonight and into tomorrow. So we may wake up and not be going anywhere. We'll have to see.
Yeah, exactly. All right. And from another part of the country that hopefully is not experiencing any snow, we have the wonderful Ann Beheler. Ann, do you want to say a quick hello? I know you're going to introduce yourself further, but that way everybody just recognizes your voice.
Sure, hello, and don't be too jealous, but it's almost 70 here. And
oh,
but hold on. It's been raining for weeks, and what I see out there is bright and yellow. I think it could be the sun.
Yeah, it's crazy. I know.
Yeah, it's pretty nice.
We have a diversity.
I'm ready for spring. I'm sure you are too.
Oh, everybody here for sure in the Midwest. All right, so you've heard a little bit from us, and we love to know who's joining us during these webinars. So Mike's going to open up a quick little poll here. This gives you a chance to play around with the polling. You can just click on whatever button describes you. Generally, we have a lot of folks from the AT program, but we often have other people too. And if you are someone who's clicked on the other button, we would love it if you would tell us who you are in the chat window. So you can just, put in community college administrator or evaluation specialist or whatever is a good way to describe who you are. It looks like Melissa is telling us a little bit something about herself. She's typing at the moment. So not surprising, we usually have lots of folks who are affiliated with AT grants, but it looks like we have some people who are from a different NSF grant program too, and we'd love to hear what program you're with. And then again, not surprisingly, have several people who are writing grants too, and sustainability. We've got some. Okay, so Melissa just said that she's a community college administrator. That's great. Okay, it looks like maybe everybody's had a chance to fill this out.
And it's always great to see when there are folks who are joining us who are actually just at the early stages. I know many may be very seasoned PIs who are just applying for another grant, but I always think that hearing about sustainability ideas is terrific timing right at the start. So glad to see you with us too.
I totally agree, Nancy, and I have to say, I think one of the things that these sustainability webinars can be very helpful. You can go back and listen to some of the other webinars that we've done over the years. I think AT is one of the few programs where they really ask you to write a sustainability plan, to talk about what you're going to do in terms of sustainability in your grant. And I think that's something that lots of PIs struggle with, particularly first-time grantees. So this is a great place to learn more about how you can think about sustainability from the very beginning. So just very briefly, most of you probably know lots about ATE, but just as a little refresher, AT stands for Advanced Technological Education, and it's NSF's it's really NSF's only funding stream that focuses on technician education, and much of the leadership in the AT community are based in community colleges. At the moment, there are about 306 projects and centers currently funded, and it really is a true community. I think if many of you have probably been to the PI conference and attended things like High Tech or come to events like these webinars, it's a very supportive, wonderful community. So if you're new, welcome, and there's lots of cross-cutting support from the projects and centers themselves to each other. And AT Central, the grant that I'm the PI for, is one of those cross-cutting projects. We really work to support grantees in all kinds of ways. We have an information hub and portal. It's a great place to find collaborators. You can see who's in state. You can easily find neighbors and friends around your own state or in neighboring states who have AT funding. We have a resource collection and an archive where we collect all the work that has been done, professional development materials, curriculum, learning objects, all kinds of things that are done as deliverables through the AT program. We have a variety of services and tools that we offer, things like this sustainability webinar, and we also support a lot of other webinar presentations through the community in collaboration with Mike, who you heard at the beginning of the webinar. And we do lots of outreach and dissemination as well. The sustainability support really grew out of a community need. We try to be very responsive to what the community spells out as their challenges, so we try to create tools and services that really respond to those needs. We do a survey every year where we ask people about their needs, and we ask them about how AT Central is doing and what we can be doing better. And one of the things that kept coming up was sustainability. And so we partnered with Nancy to do this series of workshops and webinars, and she's going to talk to you a little bit about that in just a second. And I also wanted to let you know too, we didn't mention this at the beginning, we will have breaks for questions, and please feel free to put questions as we're going along into that chat box, because we really want to make sure that we're targeting your needs as we work through the webinar, and that we're targeting the questions that you have. So I will be keeping an eye on that chat window, and if a question pops up, if you have a question for Nancy or for Anne or even for me, any of us, please just go ahead and type that in, and we will jump in and try to answer it as soon as there's a perfect time for it or a break. So I'm going to turn it over to Nancy now, who's going to talk to you a little bit about her background, and we'll dig into the meat of today's webinar.
Thanks, Rachel. So I just always like to keep this slide in here. This reminds us that when the ATE relationship with the webinars really was a relationship with an organization called Ithaca. Some of you may know it because they're the folks who created JSTOR, which is a huge database of scholarly content, including journal content, scholarly books, and even primary source materials. And I worked with them for many years as part of Ithaca SNR, which is a consulting service. And when I was there, I had a chance to do a ton of case studies to understand some of the challenges that folks face who are academics leading very entrepreneurial efforts. They're firmly in academia, but they need strategies for figuring out how to keep projects that they've developed going. And so based on kind of that knowledge, my colleagues and I developed case studies and turned that into a consulting practice and turned that also into courses. And I've been thrilled to get a chance to work with Rachael on customizing that for the ATE community over the last several years. Portico is on here too. It's a preservation service. Maybe some of you deal with that, maybe not too many yet. But in the last couple of years, my own personal sustainability strategy has also been to kind of marshal this project into my own business. And so today I actually run my own consultancy called BlueSky, the Blueprint, which does many of the same things I was doing while with Ithaca SNR. It's research, consulting, and training. And I'm just super interested in what it takes to make innovative projects tick. You know, what is the magic in there And the truth is, it's really not at all magic. There's a lot of research involved and thinking hard and looking around and seeing what else is working. And so that's some of the good thinking I hope to share in these webinars. So today's webinar is the second in a series of 3 that we're doing this year. And there's kind of a common theme here. We're looking at ways to help projects and centers, but in some years we take a very, very kind of hyper-entrepreneurial look at this, and we say, let's just see how far and how fast these projects and centers could run, could grow, maybe could even find ways to be entirely self-sufficient beyond a grant. This year we're taking a slightly more nuanced approach because we know that there are often challenges in the landscape that require it, and the reality requires it. So we're taking a look at 3 different themes that address what it might look like to move on beyond the original shape of your project. So last month we had Lori Wingate talking with us about evaluation and why that's really critical for understanding where you're at to thinking about where you might go. Today we're thrilled to have Ann Beheler with us, and we're again going to look at what we often talk about as one big sustainability plan. We're going to atomize that a little and think about what different tracks of sustainability, what flavors might look like within that whole entity that you've created. And then next month we'll have Kathy Alfano with us talking about succession planning. Every time we run a sustainability program and we don't mention succession planning, someone will mention it to us as a key thing that they worry about, especially when leaders have been successfully running projects for a long time and, approach retirement or something else. So that's what our series looks like, and if you didn't get a chance to be with us last month, definitely check out the archived webinar, and please join us also next month. But without further ado, I want you to get a chance to meet Ann right away, because she's going to be really sharing this webinar with me as we go through the different topics we're going to discuss. And she has a fantastic perspective to share. If you haven't already met her, there are very few people who can claim a career that has involved corporate life, leadership roles in the university, both as faculty member and as administrator. And Ann somehow has managed to do all these things. So I'll give her a moment to introduce herself, and then we'll jump into the rest of the presentation. Ann?
Thank you, Nancy. I have to say I still can't figure out what I want to be when I grow up. That's part of why I've done so many different things. But I have an absolute wonderful position now. I'm the principal investigator for the National Convergence Technology Center. And this is basically IT and communications that actually originated as a regional center in the early 2000s, right after the .com bust, if anybody remembers what that is. Interestingly, I had been hired at that point to grow IT enrollments for Collin College in Texas. That is the basis or the base for our grant. And right after that, the .com bust occurred and our enrollments basically plummeted. So what we did was basically reimagine the future, working with business and industry and working with partners across the nation to be ready for the upturn in IT, which fortunately did occur. We do have 8 partners nationally now that we work with, and I will be referring to them a bit because one of our sustainability strategies is to empower those partners to do many of the same things that we do. All of what we do is centered around the business and industry leadership team model, which is basically a business advisory council on steroids, whereby we provide the business people with a co-leadership role, and they're heavily involved in all we do. We also work with 64 plus colleges and university partners on a little bit less than a partner level, but not much. And I say 64 plus because with our recent renewal from last summer, we're actually moving that number to 90. We also do provide significant professional development twice a year, 4.5 days at one point and 2.5 days at another point to help faculty stay up to date. I'm also the lead for the Center's Collaborative for Technical Assistance under NSF. This was a grant that was meant to assist DOL TAC grantees, NSF grantees, and other colleges to implement best practice. And then further, I help numerous colleges help to do their programs and to do their proposals. Let's look at the background slide, which is next, and we're going to go through this really quickly. I'm a geek. I'm a math person, a computer science person, but I'm also a leader in terms of, it seems like I take on lots of roles of organizing events, organizing activities. And I have led several grants, several NSF grants, and I've also led one of those $20 million TACT grants, which has been over for a couple of years. Been a faculty member and a dean in 2 states and a VPAA in 1, corporate positions, entrepreneurial consulting business. But overall, my heart is in education, and I am delighted to lend whatever practitioner input I can to the webinar today. Thank you,
Thanks,
Nancy.
Ann. So just by way of overview, here's what we're going to be doing today, and here's why Ann is just going to be the perfect guest for today's webinar. We're going to start by, again, talking a little bit about sustainability just to get our grounding in the way we've been thinking about it here as a group, and then specifically think about how we can talk about applying this idea not just to your entire center or entire project, but possibly even just to elements of it and how we can think about it in this slightly more nuanced way. We're going to share towards the end of the webinar this idea of prioritizing and how you might use some of the information you're gaining to prioritize and refocus if you need to. And then finally, with Ann on board, we're going to be able to have her thoughts really throughout this. And I love this perspective because I feel sometimes when we talk around words like institutionalization and stakeholders. Ann sat in all those different chairs, so she has a very good and sharp eye to arguments that fly and don't fly. So especially when you start thinking about questions to ask, I'd take full advantage in the question sessions, see what she thinks. So let's go to a poll question. Rachel, you want to tee up our second poll question?
Absolutely. So we just want to know, from your perspective, in thinking about what you'd like to keep supporting and sustaining, which of these do you think really kind of hit the nail on the head for you? Mike's going to open this up. So if you're thinking about this, would you want to keep the ones that you know have the most impact, maybe you through your evaluation or however you're measuring those things, keep the ones bringing in continued funding? Or maybe you're really struggling to choose because they all feel really critical. Or maybe you have something else that we haven't thought of. And again, please enter that in chat if there's something you feel like some particular way that you're choosing or particular elements of your project or center that you'd like to keep supporting. Right. Well, it looks like most people are choosing that first one, Nancy,
which is good because you like to have participants who are idealistic, which is great.
Exactly.
We should all start off there, and that should absolutely be an aim.
Yeah, that's a high priority, and it's something that we talked a lot with Lori Wingate about when we were talking about evaluation, thinking about what has impact. And okay, all right. Well, that was great, and I think we didn't get anyone saying other, so it seems like most people are either struggling to figure out which one to choose, lots of people in that first one, and then just a couple who are in the continued
folks
who
have been with us before know that there are no wrong answers here, and if there are wrong answers, it's really just for your personal amusement that I've put them there, and they're fairly obvious. You know, these are tough questions, and the answers, this is just reflecting where your thinking is now, and hopefully by the end of the webinar, we've given you a couple of ways to make some of those choices a little bit easier if indeed you will have choices to face. So, you know, what on earth are we talking about when we say sustainability? There's so many different flavors of this, but just to start off, sustainability doesn't necessarily mean we make a lot of money from what we're doing, and it doesn't simply mean we haven't been killed off yet in some way. It's someplace in the middle of that, but I'd like to encourage everyone to think about it as identifying something special about what you do, about the value that you're delivering to the folks that you're doing this work for, in a way that creates a virtuous cycle of good things coming back, whether it could be funding, certainly should be some funding, it can be volunteer time, it can be relationships, that nurtures the project in a way that allows it to continue operating and ideally even growing. So that's definitely a very kind of holistic view. And again, there's not a right way and a wrong way to do this. Some models need more outside resource and funding. Some find it's very valuable to have earned income alongside grants. Others have models that are almost entirely volunteer and goodwill, but they find they have to do a lot of investment in keeping people doing that volunteering. So none of this really happens on its own by magic. It's a very well thought out and strategic cycle that you're going to want to create for your projects or centers. And especially at the center level where you've got so many parts moving. So, but when we think about that, it's a great and a sound logic, but do we really need to keep everything going? And this question comes up a lot. If you have a very narrowly scoped project, maybe it is really just one thing we're talking about. But many projects end up having a lot of different parts to them, and centers have a lot of different parts. So do we actually, when we think about sustainability, need to be planning to keep everything going exactly as it was the very first day we got funded? And my response to that would be probably not. There might be elements that you have found as you've gotten going that have been resounding successes. You might have found new avenues that you've grown into, and you might actually find that there's some areas that you went into with the best of intentions, but have just had a little bit less impact. And I'd suggest that there's nothing wrong with that. But it's also important to take a really good look at the whole picture to find which pieces you feel may require, may deserve your ongoing attention, maybe even increased attention or investment. And there might also be elements of what you've done, for example, where you could just decide that it's had a good run and it's time to find another solution for it and handle it in a slightly different way. So, and, you know, when I talk about this, I feel like I'm raining on everyone's parade. Why wouldn't we keep everything going? I wonder if you can share some thoughts from what you've experienced about just what the general funding environment looks like and if this approach seems useful to you. Oh, I think, Anne, you may be muted.
Anne, you're still on mute, right?
Thank you. How did you know I was talking? That's very good, because you couldn't hear me. So I think most funders or grantors are looking for innovation. In fact, I know they are. They're looking for innovation, perhaps maybe in the area it could be adaptation of something that's already working to implement at your college, but yet there is the element of innovation that is involved in it. So the word new comes to mind very frequently. Well, the new is not the same thing as continue. Most grant funding streams do not support maintenance, and the word continue is not usually appropriate in garnering either additional funding or even funding for the first funding sequence. There also, I think, has been more and more emphasis on evidence of success. It's no longer good to say, okay, I'm going to hold a training event for 100 people. 100 people come, and they fill out a smile sheet that says, oh, yes, it was wonderful, and we liked the sandwiches. They really need to, there needs to be a way to get at, okay, so what difference did it really make? And how do you gather the evidence so that if indeed you do need to seek outside funding or outside support to sustain some of the activities of a grant, you have basically a good business case for getting support to do so. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, that sounds right on. I mean, you know, I think, you know, things change, and capturing the information you need to make those arguments is awfully important. And there might be, you know, some elements that you find are extremely valuable and support those arguments better than others. I think that's kind of what you were saying.
Sure. Well, and further, I would, this is hard to do, but I'm going to say in an ideal world, which none of us live in, I would say that in your proposal, you proposed activities that you then argued were going to be impactful. And hopefully you even talked about what kind of evidence you would collect so that you are able to show that they're impactful. It's very important, in my opinion, to collect the evidence all the way along the duration of the grant. Now, will every single activity that you're doing be worthy of sustaining? Probably not. But if you do not collect the evidence, then you really don't have the documentation to support your argument for sustaining. And I will say that one way or the other, when grant funding goes away, there must be some kind of funding, and it may be in-kind type donations of time from people to sustain the activities, but there's some kind of funding that must be there to sustain any kind of activities that are involved in the grant. It just may not be actual cash.
Thanks, Anne. So let's take a look at what we're talking about. I'm going to lay out 3 different steps that I think are, some of them may seem obvious, some may be less obvious. But the first is, let's think about what you've got. Let's say you've been running this grant for a while and you've done some good works, and you want to figure out what you're looking at here. So what are some of the things of value that your project or center has created over time? I just tossed up a couple of ideas here. I'm going to guess many of you have been involved in creating curriculum. Maybe even you've had some kind of a physical or kind of very specific object like a textbook or piece of content. Maybe some of you are creating events, running national competitions and things like that. So what are some other things? Folks want to maybe drop a note in the chat window. What are some other things people have seen or people feel like they're creating in the course of their grants that they might want to think about? Yeah, so a guidebook, some workshops. So these are all like really important things. There might be assessments. That's an important one. I always wish I could type in real time on these slides and kind of build out these lists, but I'm just going to look in the chat window. Yeah, and so some of these other ideas are right on. So, and the scroll list is going so fast I can't even read it. But in addition to some of the more obvious things, I think you absolutely want to think about some of those softer outputs that actually kind of carry the greatest impact. So a lot of you were saying things like, it's the level of expertise, the trained technicians we're developing. It's the network within that community that we've created. Someone else mentioned collaborations among partners. So that's the stuff to think about as well. The real value in what you're doing, it's actually in the activity itself. That's going to signal a very different kind of sustainability strategy than if you're just looking at where do I place this curriculum so it doesn't get lost, right? It may be obvious, but in terms of sustainability, that's going to point us to a couple of very, very different strategic paths. So maybe another question for you, Anne. When you first get a grant, let's say, based on your proposal, do you always know up front exactly which the most valuable assets are going to be?
Oh, no, of course not. We think all of them are going to be extremely valuable and extremely impactful. Why else would we be asking for money to support them? But no, it's important to be very critical of the work that you're doing. I don't know where I picked up the attitude of continuous improvement, but I've had it in my repertoire, and it's how I look at life always. If we've just done something that is extremely good, perhaps we have held a training session for 150 faculty and we got rave reviews and we're riding high on the emotions, I always step back and say, okay, so how could we have done that better? And how can you figure out how to do it better unless you, without the evidence to really quantify and describe in a qualitative manner what actually worked and what didn't and what the real impact is. It's very, very important to be constantly looking at this. It's important to set it up in the first place as to how you're going to collect evidence, and also consider who's going to need to review that evidence. It probably is not a really good idea to get super, super detailed if you're only going to, well, I don't mean only, but if you're presenting to someone who really doesn't understand the super detail. But it's important to gather the evidence on a continual basis and always be very critical about what you're doing so that you can improve.
Terrific. And in fact, that's like a great segue to step 2, which is this ties perfectly in with evaluation. And so you set up those instruments at the beginning with your evaluator based on the things you know you've promised to deliver. I think what we're kind of getting at here too is that some of those softer things you may not realize. They may emerge as you do the work, and you want to capture data on that too. Even if it's qualitative and it's hard to like put a number against, the value of those relationships is awfully important. So step 2, evaluation. I know, again, it's kind of, it's obvious in some sense, because I know that everyone here has an evaluator. I know that this is a critical part, and I also know that last month we actually had a session that really, spoke to this quite extensively. So I'll refer you for a lot of detail back to last month's webinar. But this is my excuse just to reinforce the idea that this is not an evaluation process that we're talking about today. That's something that you have to send into NSF. Because I know that there's a certain amount, if I'm allowed to say this, of, let's just say, gentle positioning that may take place when you're sharing some assessment results with your funder. It's a delicate relationship. I'll mention that when I looked for images to illustrate this slide, I typed in evaluation in a little Google search window, and you will never guess what I saw. Every single image that cropped up looked pretty much like this. It showed me a checklist. And guess where everyone's finger was? It was checking the box at the very, very top. and I could totally understand the impulse that that is actually the public view that you would want to give. And you would want to nudge all of your evaluations to show great excellence everywhere. But when you think about this in terms of sustainability planning and how you're going to have to make some tough choices, this would not be the time to sugarcoat anything. This is a conversation to have with your internal team. No one else needs to know about it. You don't have to publish the results of it or even send it to NSF. But I would strongly encourage a very honest, candid conversation about which elements are going better than others and what does really, really, out of this world success look like versus, yeah, we did the thing, responsibly. I'm sure that, you would be able to know the difference there. So, So I guess, Anne, let's go. I had a couple of questions for you specifically. Well, we're going to talk a little bit about when to get started, but I think you and I agree. The answer is at the beginning, definitely at the beginning, because you don't want to miss the chance to capture anything. But maybe let's jump to the second question. We know that folks have set up questions to ask and ways to capture data on progress. But are there specific kinds of questions that to you really zero in on how to evaluate when you're looking at sustainability more than others?
Sure. I would say that the evidence to support sustainability can't be just in the eye of the grant team. It requires others to be involved to look at sustaining very many efforts. For example, and I may talk about this more a bit later, but we had some positions in one grant that actually we kept track of the career coaches. They were career coaches. We kept track of their visits with the people involved in our grant. And we were able to show by working with institutional research that the students that worked with the career coaches were in fact twice as likely to be retained just fall to spring. We didn't even go into anything very elaborate. And we were able to get 3 positions funded through the budget process. Okay, let's dissect what I just said. We kept evidence so we knew in a quantifiable fashion what had happened and could formulate a question to IR, institutional research, so that we could ask them, what can you tell us from fall to spring or fall to fall or anything like that? What can you tell us? And with that data, knowing that the budget committee cares about numbers, among other things, they care about a lot more than that, but they do care about numbers, and it's just as valid to keep a student as it is to replace a student who leaves. So with that, it's important to work with the people who are going to need to be convinced to figure out what the argument may actually be. Also, I think about, even when we write proposals, I think about the research questions, or you don't even have to put the word research. How will I know that the grant was successful? What do I want to know? And that's the thing I ask my evaluator to work with me on, because I may or may not be able to formulate the questions most appropriately to get to the data that I need. There may be several lenses that you might be looking through to consider the various things that have to be sustained. Some may be of interest to the business community. Some may be the interest of your administration. Some might be the interest of faculty. And it's important to work with those people so that you know what would make a strong argument with them.
Yeah, and this is a point you've mentioned to me before. I think it's such a smart way to think about it. It's the, if you don't mind, I think you've called it the what's in it for me approach.
Yeah, the
Is that right?
Yeah, the with
Well, and so I put this slide up here to remind myself to take a breath and tell folks a little bit about this, which is that, again, there's no real value there are very few metrics that are important absent if their future audience, their intended audience. And so when you think about the metrics to capture, in the back of your head, we want you to be thinking about ultimately who's going to care about this and why is it important to them. So the what's in it for me, for the administrators at Ann's campus is, I don't know, we're pretty happy that these career coaches are, you know, they're keeping people, they're retaining people, and they're getting them jobs. I mean, there's actual evidence that what they're doing is helping us with our core mission as educators. I'm sure that when you go through the different things that your projects and centers are doing, you can do that same exercise and be very, very precise about, of these people that you've got to secure as your helpers and supporters, which of these things do they care about most? Did I get that right, Ann?
And Nancy, there's one other thing. Yeah, that you got it exactly correct. There's one other thing, and that is when I write a proposal, I always try to make sure that the goals of the proposal are aligned with the strategic plan and mission of the college. Not just the core mission, but what is the current push for the institution on a go-forward basis. Without that alignment, it is less likely that some of the even very successful portions of the activities will be considered for sustainability.
Yeah, that's a great point. If one of the things we do in workshops is encourage people literally to have, you know, some of the strategic documents from the university or from the college available to really figure out in what ways can we make this point about alignment really, really specific. It's certainly an important direction to take. So any questions? I'll take a little pause here.
We do have a couple of questions that have come up. I've gotten a couple of emails or private chats from folks, and a couple of them are sort of around, you know, how do you think about things like continuity planning and crisis management planning in relation to sustainability planning, but also, and this sort of to me ties in, another thing that somebody chatted me was that for many of the folks in the AT community, they have very small staffs. So if you lose one key person, even though that's not really like part of your sustainability plan, it can take a long time to hire in community college and education environments. So that one key person with, you know, that set of knowledge and skills can really set you back months sometimes. So they were just sort of trying to think about, like, how do you think about those sorts of things in relation to sustainability planning. And I don't know if that's something you want to address, Anne.
I can try.
I know please, that would be great.
Well, I can try. I will say that in my opinion, because we operate on such a small staff, and this National Center operates, sometimes I think on fumes, but we still get it done. The reality is that if a key person leaves, there's probably not funding to be able to have someone to immediately step in, even if it's on a contract basis. It's always nice to be scanning the environment to see if there's someone who could step in on a contract basis. I'll contrast that with corporate America, where arguably some of our corporate friends will say that they don't have the funding to do it either, but they have a whole lot more funding than we do. When you stop and think that the center that I'm leading right now, it may sound like a lot of money, but $4 million for 5 years, and we're impacting, in some cases, 90 colleges annually. It's just a huge scalability situation done with very few people. So we don't do well in terms of immediate continuity planning. Crisis management planning, I rely on the crisis management plan from the college, and these aren't necessarily directly linked to the sustainability, although this is an interesting thought to think about that. Sustainability is post-grant for the most part. Both of these others are very important, though, to keeping the grant going. That's a very poor answer, sorry, but it's
no, I think it was great. I think it was great, and I think things are woven through in interesting ways, but I do think that piece of losing one key, we've had it happen to us too, where you lose one person, and boy, there can be some tricky months where people are wearing hats that they're surprised to be wearing suddenly. And then there was one other question. Just somebody asked if it's sort of normal or considered appropriate to create a sustainability advisory board like you would have, other kinds of advisory boards, or if that's just something you work with, if you have an advisory board, you work with them on sustainability, or is it ideal to have a specific board? And I will say for our project, we don't have a separate board that works on us with sustainability. We do have a national visiting committee, which is sort of like an advisory board, and they work with us on sustainability issues. We work a lot with our evaluator too. But to me personally, I wouldn't create, I don't know about you, Anne, but I never created something that was just sustainability focused.
No, I wouldn't either. First of all, we have too many boards or too many meetings. No one wants to have an extra meeting on their schedule unless it's really, really necessary. I think you can accomplish the same thing, and yes, we have a national visiting committee that is composed of business leaders and other grant leaders and various other key people, futurists, and so forth. We present these sorts of items to that board or that group. And further, sometimes the stakeholders that we're interested in working with are at a very high level within the college, and it requires just going and sitting in their offices and talking to them. With the business people, we meet quarterly with our business people, and if we want to bring up something there, we do. Sometimes some of the things that we bring up with them have to do with sustaining professional development, because in IT everything changes so fast, and most years we get assistance from our businesses as we go along, and hopefully after we're gone, to provide tracks that are of benefit for multiple faculty and therefore multiple students across the nation.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that what I see more often is even some fairly substantial initiatives I work with, and these can be kind of multi-million-dollar organizations that are providing services to the community. You might have an update for an advisory group, or the advisory group may help inform your thinking. Often I or my colleagues will be brought in to do an intensive piece of work with the leadership team to think through these questions, do the research needed, and come up with a proposal for how things could look going forward. But at a smaller scale, it's a set of questions that you want to focus your leadership team on, so in a fairly regular way. If you don't have any sustainability planning, you may want to set up a 3, 4, or 5 months at a time when you just zero in on it. Once you have a plan in place, you just want to continue to measure how it's progressing. I'll also mention that because this crowd here is all part of NSF, if you were, for example, looking to spin out something entirely independent as a service, there's a program called I-Core, which is more of a commercialization effort, but that takes you through the steps of understanding who customers would be. For example, if you're going to take what you do and kind of package it and bring it out to market in a different way. And then there's something called the Science Gateways Institute that also does courses on how you would think through these questions, all relating to your own project or center. But let's move along. Should we move along? Rachel, with something else?
No, I don't think we had anything else in the question, in the chat question.
But to that, I mean, to the original question about kind of crisis management, I hear that phrase with kind of a wry smile, because often we hear about sustainability planning really when something becomes a crisis. And I think the trick here is if you are constantly in touch with your key stakeholders, there can still be a nasty surprise around the corner if it's a budget that's dependent on state budgets or things utterly out of your control. But one of the big messages is to have multiple sources of support. So you're likely to be able to at least have a backup plan. The staffing thing is just super difficult. Individuals carry a lot of expertise. One of the best solutions for that is to see if those positions can be made regular by your institution and brought on board. We talk a little bit about institutionalization a couple of slides from now, and Anne can offer some guidance there too. But the main message here, just to kind of speed us along our path, is that you probably figured out that the message in this webinar is that you've got a lot of different kinds of outputs, a lot of different things that of value that you've generated, and they're not going to all require the same level of treatment going forward. So let's say one of them is a textbook or something else that's some kind of tangible output. There might be something like curriculum for a new course, say an internship program, or maybe even your entire project or center. These are just some of the things that you might have thought about that you know are going to need some kind of a response. And these responses may be very, very different. In some case, you might be looking, where do I host or store something effectively? That's pretty much done. I did it once, I accomplished it, I'm happy to move on to do something else. In what cases might you actually want to keep an activity going, but you realize that your project or center is not the right home base for it anymore? It should be owned by someone else. It could be a partner or it could be your host institution. So when do you want to hand something off to someone else? And finally, which are the kind of things that you really need to keep going? Meaning you personally, you as part of your project or center. So I'm going to suggest 3 different directions for this. We'll talk through that, and I think Anne has some wonderful insights on how and why each of these could work and when. The easiest one by far is just this idea that you're done. You finished something, you did a great job, but you don't need to worry about it anymore, which isn't to say you don't have to worry about it at all. You may want to think about how to make sure that even though you are done with it, it will continue to be available for others to benefit from. So this is for things that are finite in their output. They may not need updating, although actually we could debate that as well. But at the very least, the object itself has some value on its own. At the very least, what you're going to need is an obvious and reliable place to deposit things. And of course, on this call, as I say that, I'm immediately pointing over to ATE Central as a first place to look for what an obvious answer to that issue might be. But you also probably want to look for, there might be other partners in the fields you work in. And those partners, maybe folks who have a lot of traffic and a lot of audience participating. And so putting your materials with other materials might be a very wise path. So you want to think about what are all the assets that fall into that category, and how might you, think about what preservation, how preservation is defined. In other words, am I just putting it somewhere? Is someone going to mind it? If it's someplace that's a digital piece of digital content, will they migrate it when new formats become available and that sort of thing? Or is it just going to sit there in exactly the form I deposited it the day I sent it in? So Anne, question for you on this. You know, are there other things you would think that you would want to keep in mind when you think about this path, this kind of low bar of, I just want to put this someplace?
Oh, yes. Well, and of course, ATE Central is an obvious place for us to put archival information. The problem with that is as broadly disseminated as the ATE Central resource actually is, and it is. It's really, you know, people should know it's there. People have difficulty finding, not on your site, Rachel, but people have difficulty recognizing that, oh, that grant that's no longer in business probably has something out there and I want to go look for it. In other words, people need to know it's going to be there. I think it's also really important to pay attention to who cares if something does go away, or who's the stakeholder that would be interested in getting back to something that's archived, and mount an effort over and over and over again to ensure that you have said over and over and over again, here's where we put the material, and when you need it, go look there. Because unfortunately, people don't necessarily pick up the first time. The other thing to think about is, in the technical world, seldom is there something that we can say is done. It may be done for a point in time, but it's just not necessarily done forever. So you have to figure out, what about support? You know, how would you support? How would you answer questions? And how are you going to let people know?
I would say, even if you're deciding that it's sitting nicely on your own platform somewhere, if it's a piece of digital material, again, there might be questions about accessibility as new generations of ways to view things and ways to access things, you know, progress. So even that, no one's off the hook, really. There's a lot of layers of preservation. So let's talk about the next option here, which is, you like the idea but of continuing the work, but you know that it's not necessarily best suited to stay with you. So here, what I'm thinking about are a natural for institutionalization would be any kind of outputs, or specifically even ongoing activities that are near and dear to the heart of the institutional mission. And so I think that's just a pretty little picture of maybe Westchester Community College campus. But the point is, your host institution may have some willingness to take on things that you were initially funded for. So the how to do it, so it's nice to say, the how to do it is very, very hard. We have had, in fact, I'm pretty sure, entire webinars just on this. In fact, probably with Anne, probably last year. You can check ATE Central's website for that too. But we'll just briefly go through this now. Making that pitch to administrators is not easy. It takes a lot of evidence, and if the evidence doesn't at all look like, look how great we did with this, the evidence looks like, look at the problems that we're solving for your campus in these ways. So it's all about being able to demonstrate value to the institution. And the point to keep in mind is that even if you've done a great job doing this once, we constantly hear about challenges that happen because the administrator that became a big cheerleader moves on. And so this, again, is not something that happens once and is done, but it may take some ongoing minding. Anne, did you want to share something about things people should be keeping in mind when they hope to have, for example, roles institutionalized?
Well, yeah, again, it depends who cares if something goes away. The career coach situation, we were able to support that those were worthy of sustaining through the budget committee, and the data we provided there was very difficult from the data we provided to get the courseware and the curriculum actually turned into degree plans and certificate plans. You know, one thing I would caution people to think about is, in a technical field, just as I'm saying, things are, or curriculum is really never done, institutionalizing a certificate and a degree, it's easy to say, well, that's the business of our colleges, and so, of course, they're going to keep it all up to date. I will say, in fact, that I've worked with some colleges that don't have the funding to keep a program up to date after, in fact, it's been there for 4 or 5 years. So that has to be considered as well. I think that's all I'll say about it at this point. But other than to say, again, and reemphasize, keep in mind who's going to need the data to answer the question of how they're going to help you sustain a particular activity or program after a grant is over.
And just a question from me. I mean, when you think about something like that, is there documentation that goes along with? Would there be an MOU or any way to formalize that to avoid the fact that it may not happen?
I've never been able to get that. I don't know if it's just because I didn't ask. I never got to a point where I felt like my justification was strong enough to ask. The college, though, does have a fiduciary responsibility or an ethical responsibility that if you put a certificate and degree plan out there, that the students need to get through it and actually still be ready for the workforce. It's very, very important.
So this is
yeah, and there's a comment that nobody's ever had trouble sustaining a program when it attracts a lot of students to enroll. That's true, but sometimes what happens is that the college is not in a position to keep a program updated, and if the program, even with numbers originally, over time there has to be a commitment to keep it updated, or it will suddenly have a drop-off in enrollment.
So kind of, maybe the message is that this third path called keeping it growing, almost nothing is exempt from that, although the first and the second routes are, help to minimize maybe the amount of care and feeding it will need going forward. But I would suggest that even after you have figured out what can get stored someplace, what pieces you can stop working on, what elements you might get someone else to take on for you, you might still find that there are a set of activities, and here I'm really thinking about the things that you folks wrote in on the chat. It's the things that have to do with that really deep level of engagement, participation in the community, the partnerships, the internships, the things that are relationship-based and so impactful that you may need to keep going. That may be the heart at the end of the day of what you've done. And so what are those elements that really need to keep growing in order to be valuable? It's probably activities where you can point to real successes. And it may also be areas, somewhat opportunistically, but where you can figure out that there may be ongoing sources of support, whether that's financial or non-financial. So again, that takes a certain degree of work just to continue to cultivate those sources of support. And even if it's just time you're looking for, this is again my note to myself to remind folks that that actually takes a fair amount of time and effort. It takes money to get free things, like people's time, because you've got to plan what the outreach looks like, you've got to plan the ways for people to participate, you've got to make it easy for them to participate and fulfilling for them to participate. So even though what they're giving you, they're not charging you for, it will take an investment on your side. So to me,
in other words, the WIFM, I was just going to underscore what's in it for me. Make sure that you are always looking at what's in it for the person that's going to help you sustain.
And this model, when we talk about sustainability writ large, it's not inappropriate to think about it as if you're running a business, even though we know this is not the commercial world. But it's very much about being very strategic about where you devote your energies and making sure you've got a good balance of the resources coming in and the value going out so that you stay in some kind of equilibrium. So I'm going to share a little, and I should mention that this theme of the business strategy behind, okay, great, I figured out that all these things have to continue going forward, or these are the things to continue. How do I unlock those sources of support? That's actually the meat and potatoes of what an actual sustainability plan would talk about. It's who the audience is, what's in it for them, otherwise known as a value proposition, and how they're going to give things back to your project in a way that keeps everyone moving forward and happy. I'm going to gently leap over the questions right now just so I can share this last piece with you, and we'll have time for questions shortly after. So just to remind us, there's certain criteria that you're using to evaluate which, we keep on talking about which are the most impactful, which are the most important. But I love the way Anne is looking at it. It's not just important in general, it should be important to someone. So there might be values that are specifically attached to the fact that there are people engaging with it, maybe they're students or faculty. There might be a different set of values with those who are key stakeholders. It could be your industry partners. It could be your institution. For example, things you're doing that are really important to their mission that align quite well. And then there's also obviously your own mission. I mean, the things that you set out to do as the leader of a project or center. And finally, it's not insignificant to think about how well is this activity supporting the financial needs of the organization that I'm running. That's something that should get evaluated as well. It's all part of the mix. So here's a cute little graphic. I don't know if folks have seen this before. It's part of an interesting and very easily digestible book on nonprofit sustainability. I've modified it here a little for our uses. In brief, what the author suggests is setting up a couple of axes, right? So this is this matrix that looks at measuring here on the vertical axis where it says mission and impact. Here's the pure kind of, here's what we're in it for. This is what delivers good to the community. These are things like we're going to train people, we're going to provide them with job opportunities. This is the really heart of what you do. Along the x-axis, along the horizontal line there, is the contribution to sustaining your initiative. So sometimes that's a pure, we're getting funding for this, and sometimes it's we're going to get a lot of support if we do this. We're going to get a lot of eyeballs on this and a lot of attention if we do this. But it's a direct contribution to sustainability. And again, these things are not mutually exclusive, but this is just a provocative way to think about it. And you also have my permission to change how you name these axes. But the way these folks have set it up is interesting because what they're saying is you want to start to imagine the set of activities you're doing and asking yourself, which of these quadrants does it fall into? So for example, I'll give you an example here. You might have a couple of things. One of them might be we host a national competition as part of what we do, and it's fantastic for our mission. Students get job offers, it's fantastic. And also, we have a lot of sponsorship from industry. So we make money doing this too. It's great for us. So if you have something like that, they say that should be in the upper right corner with that nice golden star. It's delivering as high as it can on impact, and it's also delivering really high on its ability to support your sustainability. Let's say you look at another activity. I'll flip the slide again. Let's say we do a semi-annual industry brunch with students. But you know what? We've done the evaluation like Anne said we should be doing, and we figured out that at the end of the day, we're not actually getting a lot of people coming to this thing. So maybe that actually is turning out to be, a little bit lower on the scale. In this case, we thought it would be a high contribution to sustainability, but it's actually not. And in fact, the industry brunch is not delivering the impact we needed. So we're going to say it falls into this lower left quadrant where you see a stop sign. So the way to think about it is there are lots of things you do that are going to be where this heart is. It's going to be everything that the folks, on the very first poll we did, we do this because it's our mission. Pretty much 99% of what you do deserves that heart. There might be some things you do that get this tree, which means it's okay on mission. It's not bad. It's not damaging to us. But we're really doing it because we know we need to get sponsorships or we need to get a lot of attention and publicity for what we're doing. It's not for the mission. It's a bit for those other things too. There's nothing wrong with either of those. What you want to be careful about is that even if you have the best intentions, if things drop into this stop quadrant where you're really not getting the money you thought you were, the support you thought, and it's not the highest thing on your list of priorities for mission, you have permission to stop doing it. On the other hand, you want to keep asking yourself, how can we change what we're doing so that everything ends up in that upper right-hand quadrant where it's hitting the mission target squarely, and it also has found a way to have some contribution to our sustainability bottom line. So in this case, something like a national competition where it delivers on value and gives us financial support, that gets your gold star. Even if some years it didn't deliver a huge amount towards sustainability, maybe it just gets a heart, but you decide it's so important you keep doing it. But keep asking, how can we figure out ways to make it contribute to sustainability as well? So always curious to know, these questions may be more fun if we were together in person, but you want to think about which of the things we're doing. After we had gone through that set of 3 steps, we said some things we can just preserve, let's not worry about those. Some things we want to institutionalize, but for the activities we know we want to keep, how would we assign values to those? Would we be able to prioritize, even among the activities we know we want to keep, to figure out which ones are the gold stars? How can we make them, the ones that aren't, into gold stars? And actually, are there any things that we do right now that even though we thought they needed ongoing support, we might actually want to sunset? So I wonder here if we have any questions.
We don't have any questions yet, Nancy, but I also wanted to add that I think, it's a really interesting way when someone's writing a grant to start to think about sustainability too, because when you're writing it and when you just have it at first, that's a nice way to start to think about where your priorities are. As I start to think about how I'm going to measure these things, I need to keep in mind, in the back of my mind, that I'm thinking about sustainability and that quadrant. I just think it's a super easy and sort of quick way to remind yourself about your sustainability issues as you move forward. So I think it's such a super helpful sort of tight little
a really
graphic
fun thing
to kind
to
of keep in the back of your mind
I guess
when
that's
you're
a kind of
thinking
a
about
warped
these
definition
things.
of fun. But if you have, say, your leadership team sitting around a table, you kind of put that graph up on the board, and you kind of sketch out, let's list the 5 or 6 main activities we're doing this year, or we're doing within this grant. Where would you put things? How would people agree on where they all belonged?
Right.
And once they were up there, would it help people to make some choices about not necessarily to kill anything,
Absolutely.
although you could decide that, but where should we reinvest? Look how great this one is doing. Maybe we really need to push that along faster.
I'd also comment that though I made such a heavy emphasis on planning from the very beginning, it's important to recognize along the way on a grant that you may want to change how you're going to figure out whether something is working. You may have to change the way you get evidence or who might be able to support it after it's over. It's not sustainability one and done from the very beginning, and then you just execute. It has to be a process of continuous improvement all the way along the way.
That's a great point. So an exercise like this, it's great to take some guesses at the start, but wouldn't it be great to do this every year once in an annual meeting? How are things going? How has it changed? So let's
Or more often than that.
So let's tee up this poll question. I'm aware of our timing today. We've had so much great stuff to cover, but I want to make sure you guys have a chance to ask Anne any final questions before we wrap up. So when you think about sustaining the impact of our goal, you see, it was such a leading question. You're right. Because if you had said you still want to do it all, I would really just have to hang this up, hang up my work here. But yeah, so it's great. I mean, there are these are not obvious choices to make, but I think the key message in this webinar is think about a couple of different tools for looking at the elements of your work in case something happens, in case you decide to shift focus, in case the funder decides you may have to continue on at a different level of funding. There could be reasons why you're going to have to make choices, and here you have a couple of new tools you can use to do that. Great. All right, so terrific, very helpful. So about 10 say that we're going to make strategic choices about the areas to invest in, and several others say that we have issues that will force us to stop. And I know all of the above doesn't quite work along with that in the same way, but I'm sympathetic to all the choices folks are facing. So here are the next couple steps. What you want to think about is sketch out that inventory. It's kind of an amusing task because you may find that there are some things that hit the list that you didn't originally realize were going to be so interesting, particularly in those soft things, those relationships that you've been building over time, and areas of expertise you've been developing over time. Have a look at the existing evaluation results. You have lots of data that your evaluators helped you to get. This is a chance to take a fresh look and ask yourself not just are those good numbers, but for whom are those good arguments? And then finally, I'd encourage you to think about it in terms of paths. Which things can we place someplace else, and so we can sleep easy at night knowing knowing they're well cared for? Which can someone else help us with? And for the ones you want to keep doing yourself, think about what those sustainability strategies are for ongoing support. Figure out even which of them need the most support. And again, there's lots of material on Rachael's site at this point that even goes so far as to talk about different revenue strategies and partnership strategies that you can employ if that's what you're looking for. So, Rachael, before I mention our final webinar and ask people to take our survey, was there anything else you wanted to mention?
No, I think we had one other question where someone wanted to kind of know how they could estimate which revenues could come from sales of materials. In other words, they were talking a little bit about market penetration.
Question, but in this case, that is a little tricky. And what I would say is I know it's a little bit tricky. We have done webinars that are specifically on revenue strategies and even projecting revenue for different streams of work. It's so specific to what the content is, who the market would be. Yeah, so that's very tricky.
Deirdre.
I couldn't answer.
So
right. And they can follow up with an email too, but Max can follow up with an email to Ann and Nancy and lay that out a little, because it's not quite clear what's being asked, I think, too. I think maybe need a little bit more information.
And
so maybe we can follow up with an email if they'd like more details on that.
But you're exactly correct that it depends on what's being sold, how do you figure out what market penetration might possibly be, and it's going to be an iterative type thing along the way. Plus, depending on the funding that you have, you may or may not be able to have a revenue stream without using the revenue from that stream first before you use your grant funding. But there are other ways to set that up as well.
Oh, yeah. That's a great point. All right. So Nancy, you're going to talk about, it's our final, not only is it our final webinar
so there'll be cake
in the series, it's our final webinar in the 5-year program. It's crazy.
Yeah, and I hope people can join us
it'll be virtual
next month. I feel like some of the webinars this year are very, very practical. But again, the theme of succession planning has been a big deal. And after hearing questions today, specifically not just about leadership succession planning, but even continuity among staff, we may think about how we can work in some of those themes as well. Meaning that, the value is really in your staff and in the expertise that your team has developed. There are certain challenges that happen when the lead, who have been the lead for a very long time and is closely identified with that project or center, is moving on or retiring. But actually, we do understand that that issue can become quite dramatic even when it's not the lead. It might just be a key member of the team. So I thank the group today for actually reminding me that that's an element we should tackle as well. So please join us April 10th at 1 p.m. Eastern for our webinar on succession planning. But before we sign off for the day, we do have a survey. So Mike, is this the right time to ask people to take that?
I think Mike is going to. Yep. It is. So Mike is going to open that up.
Evaluation, meaning our webinar evaluation. So this is
sorry, go ahead, Nancy.
Extremely helpful to us to see how things are going, to make sure that what we're offering you is actually what you need to be learning. So feel free to share any thoughts with us here.
Nancy and Rachel, that survey does open for folks in a different window, though the webinar window is still open for most people underneath. There's a few computers, systems that the participants may actually have to click on the link and browse to it. It's just sort of a thing. And we'll send out that link with our post documents that include the recording and the slides from today. And for those of you who might not have gotten the survey or might not be able to activate it, again, we'll send that link to you with the post documents. So Rachel, that officially...
I put the last, I don't know if it's visible to people, I put the thank you slide up, also because it includes Rachel's contact information, but also mine and also Anne's. And it's just a reminder that obviously if there are questions that you still feel you'd like to ask, we're all available to follow up with you. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this. And thank you. Yeah.
Nancy, the survey box actually covers up our email addresses, so you know, maybe we can send that out too.
Yeah.
Oh, but Anne's is
Oh,
not
there we
there.
go. Mike just moved
it in there.
Yay. Whoops, but Anne's.
Sure.
Anne, can you put your, that's okay. Anne, can you put yours in chat? Your email address in chat? That would be great. Thanks to everybody. And Mike also put up the link in chat. So if for some reason, because it happened to me also, just this is the first time that's ever happened, the survey didn't open in my window. So I had to click on the URL that Mike sent. Not that I'm filling out the survey, but I always like to make sure it's actually loading. Thanks to Terrell, who was with us, for a nice compliment there. Thanks, everybody.
That officially
and there's Anne's email. Yep, and I think we're right at the end, aren't we, Mike?
Thank you, Anne, for joining us as well. We'll be closing down the audio part of our system, and I'll leave that survey up for a few minutes, and then we'll shut down the system for today. So thanks, everyone.
Thanks for joining us.
Bye.
You're welcome. Bye, everyone.
Great.
Goodbye.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks so much, Anne. Great webinar. Bye, everybody.